They called it a fool's cabin, not in jest, not in meanness, but in the sort of scoffing certainty that men in the mountains used when shaking their heads at something too strange to argue with. That old trapper dug wrong, built wrong, thought wrong, they'd mutter over black coffee in town, buried half his house like a scared mole, sat there reading scripture in a hole like a coyote in winter, claimed he could keep it warm with a single log a day, said heat don't rise, it stays, if you know how to trap it, and then they'd laugh. But when the worst blizzard in frontier history came down from the Rockies in late December, thicker than sackcloth, louder than gunfire, and colder than death, they weren't laughing. By New Year's, not a horse could break through the pass, not a telegram line held, not a soul had heard from the outlying ranches. Folks huddled in the little mining town of Brickens, stranded by 10-foot drifts and screaming wind. The firewood stacked behind their saloons and boarding houses vanished by the second night. On the third, they burned furniture. By the fourth, a baby froze to death in its sleep. The fifth night, a widow set fire to her own pantry just to warm her daughter's hands. That was the night someone remembered the trapper. Nobody ever remembered him by name. He was the Dutchman, that fellow on Switchback Ridge, or the hole dweller. He came to town rarely, bought flour in odd amounts, wore patched buckskins, and spoke with the slow drawl of someone who thought twice before breathing. Claimed his old ways were better, that he didn't need more than a single stick of pine a day, that warmth wasn't made by fire alone but by design. Back in October, when they'd seen smoke rise from the clay chimney tucked against the western slope, folks said, "He's starting early, must be sick." But now, with the wind howling like the devil's choir and no warmth left to burn, they started saying something else. That old fool might be the only one warm for 50 miles. And so, come dawn on the sixth day, Sheriff Hal Crowder knocked ice from his beard and took 6 men on snowshoes up towards Switchback Ridge. What they found would be spoken about for 100 years, because not only was the trapper alive, he was waiting for them, calm as still water, standing in the doorway of a half-buried cabin that steamed like a bathhouse while the world froze. Inside, it smelled of boiled barley and cedar smoke. His cheeks were pink with warmth. The walls were mud-plastered logs, the ceiling low and tight, and the entire front wall half sunken into the slope of the mountain, and on the hearth, a single log smoldered, not blazing, just smoldering, radiating a heat that filled every inch of the compact room. No draft, no waste, just pure, contained warmth. The trapper said nothing at first, just handed the sheriff a bowl of soup and nodded toward the benches around the hearth. There were 7 of them, 7 seats, carved from earth and cedar, like he'd been expecting company all along. Sheriff Crowder set down the bowl, half drunk, and looked him dead in the eyes. "We've got children freezing in Brickens, women burning their own quilts. You tell me right now, how the hell is this place warm enough to sweat?" The trapper wiped his mouth. "Because I built it like a womb, not a saloon." They didn't understand, not then, but 2 days later, 25 townsfolk trudged through the snow with sleds, blankets, and frostbitten children. By the 4th day, there were over 60 huddled into the trapper's dugout, and the earthworks he'd shown them how to dig beside it. The mountain became a burrow of heat and clay. The wind screamed, but inside, it was quiet. The storm would last another 12 days. In town, 3 more would die. But up here, not a single soul would lose a finger. And yet the strangest part was not the survival. It was what the trapper revealed next, about why he'd built the cabin the way he did, about the woman he lost, the child he buried, the blueprint he'd carried for 30 years, drawn by a man who died before the Civil War, a design dismissed as fantasy. Until now, the trapper's name was Abram Kessler, and this is how his foolish cabin saved an entire town from vanishing into the snow. The first night with the townsfolk under his roof, Abram Kessler sat quietly on his stool, pipe in hand, while 60 souls wrapped in wet wool and patchy flannel lay sprawled across his clay floor like corpses waiting for judgment. They were too weak to talk. Some cried silently from the warmth. Others, especially the older ones, just stared at the fire like it was something sacred, like a hallucination come true. A few didn't trust him. That was fine by Kessler. He didn't trust them either. He wasn't built for crowds. The mountains suited him because it didn't ask him to explain himself, not like people did. Sheriff Hal Crowder had taken up a spot near the fire, legs stretched out, hat on his chest, breathing deep. His boots steamed by the hearth, and every so often he'd look toward Kessler like he still couldn't believe the man was real, that the stories were true, that this half-buried mole of a man had built something better than any hotel or stove in Brickens. "You built all this just for you?" the sheriff finally asked, voice low, tired. Kessler nodded once. "Didn't plan on guests, but it's warm everywhere. I don't let heat leave." Crowder shifted, glancing at the low ceiling. "You mean you trap it?" "I let the earth hold it. Clay don't argue with heat. It stores it, stays gentle, breathes a little. You pack the logs right, press the walls tight, Dig your bench beds into the floor. Seal your roof with moss and straw. Don't take much to stay warm. Just one log burns all night, if you burn it right. Crowder blinked. It ain't even dry pine. Don't need to be. I'm not trying to make light. I'm making life. That line sat heavy on the sheriff. He didn't reply. Out the small, oval window near the chimney, the storm had softened. Only flakes now, gentle, slow, like regret. But no one inside believed it would stay calm long, not after what they'd seen already. Mrs. Bellows, a widow with 3 children under 10, sat nearest the stove. Her hands trembled as she spooned stew into her boy's mouth. The child hadn't spoken since they'd left town. His lips were blue, but under the smoldering light of the single log, color began to return to his cheeks. "Why is it dug down like this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ain't no other cabin I seen like this." Kessler blew a thin stream of smoke, watching it curl toward the ceiling like it too was trying to understand. "Because cold don't like low places. It sinks, but it don't stay. Once I warm the earth beneath me, it holds the heat better than any wall can. Fire rises, but heat ain't fire. Heat wants to live. You just have to give it a home." Another long silence. Then, the old prospector Beatty, hunched in a corner with frost still in his beard, asked what no one else dared. "You really only burn 1 log a day?" Kessler looked him in the eye. "Sometimes 2 when I'm feeling generous." They didn't laugh, not because they were scared, but because they believed him now. He wasn't some lunatic. He wasn't just lucky. He knew something they didn't. The next morning, as pale sun pushed through the mist and frost steamed off the log roof, Kessler led a small group out to the slope above the dugout. They shuffled through knee-deep powder to a rise overlooking the basin. That's when they saw it, the valley below, where Brickens lay, choked in a frozen sea of white. Chimneys gone, roofs collapsed, 1 or 2 black scars where desperate fires had gotten out of hand. It looked less like a town now, and more like the remnants of a battlefield. "Don't look like it'll be any kindling left down there," muttered Crowder. "Won't be any people left either," said Mrs. Bellows quietly. Kessler chewed the inside of his cheek. "Storm's not done. I've seen these kinds before. Wind calms. Makes you think it's passing. Then it comes back madder, hungrier. Ain't the cold that kills you? It's the hope in between." He turned and pointed toward the slope behind his dugout. "We'll dig there." Crowder frowned. "Dig what?" "Burrows, earth rooms, clay bunkers. I got enough timber to show you how to line one. You'll need to dig 4, maybe 5, before nightfall." The townsfolk behind them looked doubtful. Dig? With what? They were half-starved, frostbitten, numb. But Kessler didn't wait for permission. He handed Crowder a spade, then grabbed a crude pickaxe and began working the earth with stiff, deliberate strikes. By midday, 12 men were digging alongside him. By dusk, the first burrow was finished. The inside was strange. No square walls, no sharp corners. A rounded dome, packed clay, like the inside of a wasp's nest. Timber poles set into notches, thin sod roof with snow stacked atop it, not cleared away. The fire pit wasn't in the middle, but off to the side, dug slightly below the floor, with a draft channel that led up and out. "Heat rises," Kessler explained, "but drafts move, so we tilt the drawer, let smoke go one way, heat go the other." "But it ain't even a real chimney," Crowder said. Kessler shrugged. "Doesn't need to be." That night, the second wind of the storm returned, and it came screaming. The kind of screaming that makes you believe in demons. Inside the earth homes, folks huddled together like kin. They'd followed Kessler's instructions down to the grain, bedded straw beneath them, clay benches along the wall to sleep raised but still warm, roof low enough to feel your breath against it, draft tucked carefully into the earth slope behind. 1 log burned in each, just as he said, and it worked. The storm roared like a beast denied entry, but within the rounded walls it was quiet, more quiet than Brickens had ever been. Even in summer, people began to weep. One man, Doran, the schoolteacher, took off his coat for the first time in days and just sat there, eyes closed, steam rising off his shoulders. "I forgot what this felt like," he whispered. "I forgot heat could be gentle." They weren't used to warmth without fire. They weren't used to comfort without pain. But this wasn't comfort, not really. It was survival, and Kessler had known how to do it all along. The children were the first to ask questions. They followed Kessler like ducklings, watching how he packed the clay, how he stacked the logs, how he pulled coals from the fire, and buried them in ash to stay alive through the night. "You ever been in a storm like this before?" asked little Ruth Bellows, her face pink again, her voice returning. Kessler paused, looked down at the girl. "Yes," he said after a while. 31 years ago. Lost my wife, lost my boy." No one spoke after that. He didn't say more, didn't have to. That was why he'd built the cabin. That was why he knew what the rest of them didn't. He'd already died once, and he'd built his house so he'd never die again. By the 10th day, the food ran low. What little had been packed from town was gone. Kessler showed them how to make barley broth, how to cook pine needle stew, how how to trap snow mice beneath sod mats. Some grumbled, but not the sheriff, and not the mothers. They saw the truth. This man had saved them not just with heat, but with knowledge. Things they'd all forgotten, things no one thought mattered anymore, like how heat could move sideways, like how smoke could rise through a tube of packed moss and never choke you, like how your breath alone could warm a room, if the room was built right. They didn't laugh at him now, they listened. Then, on the 12th night, a sound broke through the wind, a scream from the tree line. Someone was out there, a straggler. Crowder and 3 others threw on furs and ran out into the storm, guided only by the echo. What they found would nearly break them. A boy, no older than 10, half frozen, barefoot. He'd come all the way from the northern ridge, alone. His father had died 3 days back, his mother before that. They'd tried to make it to Brickens, thinking town would be safer. But the boy remembered the stories of the whole man on the ridge. He'd gambled everything on a legend, and the legend had been true. Crowder carried him back himself. The boy's toes were black, his voice was gone, but his heart still beat. That night, as the fire glowed low and the people gathered tight in the dugouts, someone finally said what they were all thinking. This man's not a fool, and no one contradicted them, not anymore. The boy's name was Nathaniel Reed. His breath came shallow as they pulled off his frozen shirt and tucked him into the warmest corner of Kessler's main cabin. It was Ruth Bellows who held his hand through the night, while Kessler wrapped his feet in hot cloths soaked in broth, not water, whispering to no one in particular. Boil bark if you must. Just keep the heat steady. Don't rush it. You rush it, you kill the tissue. Crowder crouched near the fire, watching the boy's face twitch with every jolt of pain. The black had climbed nearly to his ankles. They all knew what that meant. In town, they'd have cut it off. Amputation with a kitchen saw and whiskey, maybe prayer. But Kessler didn't reach for the saw. He reached for clay, pressed it into a thin layer, warmed it by the hearth until it steamed slightly, then packed it around the boy's feet like a second skin, covered it with moss, changed it every 4 hours, never spoke about it, just did it. And 3 nights later, to everyone's disbelief, the black began to fade. The boy kept all 10 toes. "You sure you ain't some old doctor?" asked Crowder. Kessler just gave him a look and said, "No man who knows what a soul costs ever tries to play God. I just watched long enough to see what works." It was the only time anyone heard him raise his voice. By the 15th day, the wind had softened to a low groan, like a dying beast still pawing at the door. Snow no longer fell in sheets. The white glare gave way to cloudy pale light, and when Crowder stepped out one morning to check the trapline, he saw the outline of the mountain again for the first time in weeks. But instead of celebrating, he just stood there, quiet. The ridge was gone, collapsed. The only trail back to Brickens, buried beneath 12 feet of packed snow and fallen timber. They weren't stranded anymore. They were sealed in, and that changed everything. Food became tight again. Kessler's root cellar, once half filled with jars of bear fat, dried peas and pine flour, was nearly empty now. 60 people can eat through a year's provisions in less than a month if they're scared enough. It was Mrs. Timmons, a mother of 4, who first asked what nobody wanted to say. "What happens if we run out?" The silence after that was long and thick as frozen bark. "Then we learn what hunger really means," Kessler answered. "But we won't die, not if we do it right." "How?" Crowder asked. Kessler stood and motioned for him to follow. He led them to a shallow ravine beyond the far side of the ridge, a place no one had dared walk in days. The wind was calmer there, funneled through the rock in such a way that it never fully touched the earth, a silent hollow, and in that hollow Kessler revealed the second part of his plan. "You ever eat cattail root?" he asked. Crowder frowned. "Is that a plant?" Kessler grinned. "It's a miracle. God plants it where men forget to look." He showed them how to dig through the frozen mud, how to snap the white stalks, boil them until they broke apart into a starchy mush. He showed them how to pull tree bark from pine, scrape the white inner flesh, dry it, then boil it again into a gruel thick enough to eat. He taught them to make bread out of moss and snow lichen, bitter, green, and ugly, but filling. He taught them to chew dried hides and suck marrow from old bones. He taught them how to survive without killing a single animal, because they needed the animals alive come spring. "Fire keeps you warm," he said one morning, "but food keeps you sane." It was Ruth who finally asked what they'd all begun to suspect. "Did you ever have to live like this before?" Kessler didn't look at her. "I still live like this." At night, when the children slept and the wind was silent for once, the adults would gather in the main cabin, listening to the low hiss of the hearth log, watching its red heart throb like something alive. It was then the stories would begin, slowly at first, like thawed snow. People remembered who they were. Beatty talked about the mine he lost in '83. Crowder spoke of his brother, dead from pneumonia. Mrs. Timmons, her voice shaking, told of the baby she'd buried in the churchyard 3 winters back, and how the cold had cracked his tiny coffin. It wasn't pity they shared, it was memory, the kind of remembering only suffering could summon. And Kessler, he sat and listened, until one night, after Crowder passed him a flask and said, "You ever want to tell us about your boy?" Kessler finally spoke. "I built this cabin for him," he said, eyes steady. "Not for me. I wanted to make something that held warmth, a place the world couldn't reach. He was always cold, even in summer. Had a condition, bones brittle, skin pale, couldn't run, couldn't shout. He'd sit by the window and say, 'Pa, why's the wind so mean?' I didn't have the words then, so I swore I'd beat the wind. I swore I'd learn how to outsmart it." He paused. His hands shook. "But I learned too slow." No one spoke. Even the fire seemed quieter. He looked down at his hands. "I've been fixing this place for 20 years. Every winter, one more improvement, one more trick, not to stay alive, but to atone. And then, softer. He died in my arms. I lit every log I had, burned the roof near down. But it wasn't heat we needed. It was design. I didn't know how to build warmth back then, only how to beg it from flame." He took a long breath. "I ain't been cold since, but I ain't been warm either. They didn't treat him the same after that. He wasn't the hermit anymore, or the hole dweller. He was something else, a father, a penitent, a prophet of heat. And when Ruth snuck up behind him 2 nights later and hugged his waist without saying a word, he didn't push her away. He just stood there, letting it happen, letting the warmth come. By the 21st day, the snow began to melt, not by much, but enough. Icicles dripped, the clay roofs began to sweat, and for the first time in weeks, a hawk circled the ridge above. That night, they held a feast, the last of the barley, 1 preserved squirrel, and half a jar of canned apples Kessler had saved for years. They sang songs, not loud ones, just old ones, fragments, chants that grandmothers once taught in lamplight. And in the center of the dugout circle, the children danced. They danced barefoot on warm clay, beneath a roof made of mud and moss, beside a hearth with 1 single log still glowing like a miracle. And that night, no one cried, not even Kessler. But storms don't leave quietly. They always try to take one last thing, and just before dawn, they would, not a person, something older, something colder, a danger no one saw coming, except him. Because heat, once freed, always has something to answer to. And the final test of his cabin, the real test, was still coming. It started with a hiss, not from the fire, but from beneath the wall itself. An odd, crawling sound, like steam leaking from a kettle you couldn't see. Kessler noticed it first. He rose from his bedroll before the sun, barefoot on the warm clay floor, listening with his head slightly cocked and eyes narrowed. For 3 weeks the dugout had been quiet. Too quiet, in fact. The wind had died. The cold had faded. The storm had stopped screaming. And that, more than anything, worried him. He moved to the back of the cabin, to a small patch of wall behind the stove where the earth met timber and moss. He laid a palm flat against it. It was wet, not with condensation, but with pressure. The earth was pushing inward. His eyes widened. Within the hour, the ridge would shift. He rushed out into the rising light and climbed the rear slope. The town lay far behind them, still frozen in white, but the ridge above, the same slope that had shielded them from the storm, was sagging, slumping inward like the belly of a dying animal. Snowmelt had worked its way beneath the packed clay of the slope, carving hidden channels, breaking seams beneath the roots. What had once held heat now held weight, heavy, dangerous weight. Kessler turned back fast, leaping through powder, shouting to the nearest shelter. "Up! Everybody up! Clay's going! We have a sink coming!" People scrambled awake. No one asked questions. Not anymore. They moved with muscle memory now. Grab what you can, move toward the fire, stay low, listen for Kessler's voice. By the time he reached the main dugout, the hissing had become a low moan, like a throat full of gravel. Crowder met him at the door. "You telling me it's a landslide?" "No," Kessler snapped. "It's worse. It's a collapse. The heat's been melting the bottom of the snowpack. That whole rear slope is ready to drop into our rear wall. We don't clear it now. It'll come down on its own." How long? An hour, maybe less. It took 30 seconds for the word to spread. 2 minutes to form a chain. Within 10, they had spades, pots, even iron pans and flat boards. Anything to dig, anything to move earth. And for the first time since the storm began, they all saw what Kessler had really built. Not just a warm place, but a delicate one, a balance, a living organism of fire, mud, and breath. And now, it was suffocating. The slope moaned again. Children were rushed toward the far edge of the slope, away from the weight. Elders too. The able-bodied stayed. And the trapper, he dug, like the ghosts of his wife and son, were trapped inside that ridge. He didn't shout, he didn't growl, he just moved, carving channels, stripping moss, reinforcing beam joints with lashings made of hide and gut. They mimicked him, without words, like ants in a flood. Sweat poured from their faces, though the wind bit cold. Snow turned to slush under their boots. Someone sang under their breath. A miner's work song, just a verse, just to keep breathing. The rear slope groaned louder, a sound like thunder from the inside of the earth. Then silence, the kind of silence that only comes before a fall, and fall it did. Not the whole ridge, but enough. A chunk the size of a rail car peeled loose like a rotten tooth, sliding down toward the dugout wall where the children had slept just the night before. Kessler saw it before anyone else, and he ran straight for it. Crowder shouted, "No!" But it was too late. The trapper threw himself into the slope, grabbing a brace beam, one of the angled logs that had been half buried for weeks, and wedged it deep beneath the weight of a second beam, already sinking into the clay. Then, without hesitation, he jammed his shoulder into it and held. For a moment, the whole slope seemed to pause, and then it stopped. The log didn't break, the roof didn't cave, the snow held still. Kessler's legs buckled, but the wall remained upright. Men rushed in with new supports. Ropes were lashed. A trench was cut to redirect the meltwater away from the base. By dusk, the collapse had been halted. The dugout stood. The town had been saved again, but Kessler had to be carried back inside. His shoulder was crushed, not broken, crushed. Crowder laid him on the warmest bench inside the main cabin, where the last log still smoldered in the hearth. Ruth Bellows and little Nathaniel Reed sat nearby, watching with eyes too old for their age. The trapper's breathing was ragged. "I ain't dying," he said between gasps. "Not from dirt. I buried too many bones to let it take me." Crowder tried to smile. "You're too stubborn, I'll give you that," Kessler coughed. "This place is by more than me now. You hear me? Don't treat it like a miracle. It's a lesson. Build like this again. Wherever you go, build down, build tight, let the heat live." Crowder nodded. "We will." Kessler grabbed his arm. "Swear it." "I swear it." The trapper leaned back, closed his eyes. His breath slowed, and then, for the first time since they'd arrived, the wind outside stopped completely. The next morning, it was quiet. Birdsong returned. Not loud, just a whistle, a single pine warbler, then another, and then, in the far distance, a hawk's cry. Spring had started to rise. When they stepped out of the dugout, the air smelled like wet earth and thawed bark. The sun touched the edge of the ridge, and in its light they saw how much had changed. The slope was scarred, yes, but alive. The snow was cracked and melting. Trees that had vanished beneath white were slowly showing green again. The path to Brickens would take weeks to dig out, but no one feared anymore. They knew how to wait now. Crowder assembled them on the flattened clay yard in front of the dugout. "We were saved by a fool," he said, and then with a smile. "A fool who saw what none of us could, who remembered things we forgot, who built what we thought was madness, and made it a home." He paused, looked toward the cabin where Kessler lay resting. "We'll rebuild Brickens, better, warmer, with walls that breathe and roofs that hold. We'll remember this place, not as a refuge, but as a beginning." The people nodded, and for the first time they did not cry. That night, as the last ember glowed in the hearth, Kessler whispered to Crowder, "There's a set of papers in the floorboard. Plans, notes, blueprints. They ain't pretty, but they're true. You make sure folks see 'em." Crowder reached beneath the bench and found a bundle wrapped in buckskin. Handwritten notes, drawings of heat channels and clay walls, moss traps and wind diverters. "Your boy would have been proud," Crowder said. Kessler didn't answer. He was already dreaming. Spring would come slowly, but it would come. The town would return, but it would return different, because now they knew something. Now they had seen it. A single log, a dugout home, a man once mocked, and 63 souls who'd learned what it meant to build heat. But the true ending, that was still one night away, because not everyone was saved yet, not until the snow revealed what still lay beneath it. The sun rose slow on the 32nd day, pale and uncertain, like a child peeking through frost. The last of the deep snows was beginning to crack, but still the drift stood taller than a man. From the ridge, the horizon shimmered not with warmth, but with the faint breath of spring pushing through the ice, and that was enough to wake a kind of hope. Even the trapper's cabin hadn't stirred fully. Yet something heavier still lingered, something left unfinished, unburied. Nathaniel Reed, the boy who'd arrived half dead in the night with blackened toes and no voice, was the first to speak it aloud. "My pa and ma," he said hoarsely, standing near the edge of the slope. "They're still out there, somewhere in it." No one answered. Crowder laid a hand on the boy's shoulder, but he didn't lie, didn't say maybe, or could be, or "we'll see," because they all knew what snow could hide, what it could keep. But Kessler, sitting in the doorway, wrapped in a quilt stitched from scraps the women had pulled together, looked at the boy and said, "Where'd you lose 'em?" Nathaniel sniffled. "We were headed toward Brickens, from the old Jensen homestead. My pa said the ridge path would be faster, but the wind came hard. We camped 3 nights. The 3rd morning, they didn't wake up. Did you mark it?" I think I did. I tied a red rag on a branch, but I don't remember how far." Kessler nodded once. "Slow. That's enough." That morning, 3 men prepared a sled, 2 from Brickens and Crowder himself. They packed broth, rope, and one of Kessler's burn-slow logs wrapped in ashcloth to retain heat. The trapper gave them careful directions: how to find melt lines in the snow, how to watch the pitch of shadow to judge the lay of buried slopes, how to prod for hidden hollows beneath the crust where bodies or beasts could be waiting. The wind had finally died, but the cold wasn't gone. Not yet. Before they left, Kessler whispered something to Crowder, a quiet instruction, something final. Crowder didn't argue. He just nodded, then turned toward the ridge and led the way. They found the red rag just before dusk, tied to a pine's low branch, half-eaten by ice. Beneath it, the remains of a shallow snow camp, flattened snow, the curve of a wind wall, a dent where a pot had sat too long, and farther still, in a shallow ravine tucked from view, the frozen forms of Nathaniel's parents. A man curled over a woman, his arms around her, her hands still holding the boy's old scarf. Neither had been scavenged, neither disturbed. They had died quietly, together. Crowder crouched beside them, and Ace removed his hat. "Come spring," he said softly, "we'll bury you proper. But for now, rest easy." He made it. "The boy's warm now." He turned to the others. "Let's get the scarf and the ring. That's what the boy'll want. Leave the rest to the earth." But one of the men, the miner named Finch, pointed to a rock nearby. There, half buried in the snow, was a rusted tin box. They dug it out. Inside were pages, a few coins, and a letter. Crowder unfolded it, read slowly, then folded it back, tucked it in his coat and whispered, "They weren't running from anything. They were running toward the trapper." When they returned, Nathaniel didn't ask what they'd seen. He just stood with the scarf in his hands, holding it to his face. And Kessler? He didn't speak. He just reached out and gently set his palm on the boy's shoulder. That was the first time he'd touched anyone since the collapse, and it was the last time he'd stand. That night, the cabin felt strange, not colder, just quieter, like a violin after its last note. Kessler slept deep. His breath came slow but steady. People took turns sitting with him. Ruth Bellows brought broth he didn't drink. Crowder read the letter aloud to him, even though the old man never opened his eyes. It was from Nathaniel's father, a letter meant for whoever might find their boy. It read, "If he makes it to the trapper, he'll live. I taught him how to follow snow marks, how to move slow. We heard of your cabin back in August. Folks said you were mad, but I don't think so. I think you found something the rest of us forgot. If our boy reaches you, teach him. Teach him everything. Let him carry it forward. Even if we don't make it, let him build heat." The room was silent when Crowder finished. No one wept, because the weight was too big for tears. Kessler died that night, not with drama, not with gasps or visions. He simply stopped. His last breath came with the dawn. Crowder was there. So was Ruth. They buried him beneath the slope, near the hearth wall, just beyond the reach of the heat he'd made, but inside the clay he'd packed with his own hands. It wasn't a grave so much as a resting room, circular, reinforced, safe from the melt, a place where warmth would never leave him. They carved a message into the stone above. He built heat. In the weeks that followed, as the trail to Brickens was cleared and the townsfolk began to return to what was left of their homes, something unexpected began to happen. They didn't rebuild the old way. They didn't stack wood and hope. They dug, they shaped, they packed earth, they built heat. Kessler's diagrams were copied, passed hand to hand, then nailed to the schoolhouse wall like scripture. The children memorized them, the men debated them, the women refined them, and every single home rebuilt after that storm bore the mark of the foolish trapper. Low ceilings, clay benches, side-fed stoves with ash vents, moss-lined draft tubes, and one smoldering log, just one. That was all it took. Years later, travelers passing through would marvel at the warmth of the town's buildings. "Feels like they hold the heat," they'd say, "like the walls themselves are alive," and the locals would smile. "Ask the kids," they'd say. "They know the story," and they'd point to the plaque on the schoolhouse, a bronze plate set into the stone, dedicated to Abram Kessler, who built a home the wind couldn't break. But that wasn't what folks remembered most. Not the storm, not the warmth, not even the log. What they remembered was the way he looked at people, the way he listened, the way he forgave the world for being so cold, and answered it not with fire, but with design. And in one small cabin, tucked against the mountain slope, still half buried in earth. A single room remained unchanged, its hearth still intact, its benches still warm. A place built not just to last, but to teach. And every winter, on the coldest day, the townsfolk would walk the ridge, gather inside, and light one single log. They'd sit in silence, let the warmth rise, let the walls breathe, let the heat live, and the children would ask, was he real, that trapper? And their parents would nod and say, realer than most, because fools burn fire to keep warm. But the wise, they build heat.